Hello and welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. So China has declared it's ready to fight after it ended its 4 days of military drills surrounding Taiwan. The drills were in response to the Taiwanese president sitting down with Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California last week. China announced it would be conducting military exercises similar to the ones that they conducted after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan last year. Here's a clip their military posted saying they're ready to fight against Taiwanese independence and external aggravators. Let's watch.
我们充分预想真实战场各种复杂困难条件，按照实战化流程和作战编组展开火力突击，有效检验弹再加上接令即打、随时能战能力。
这次军事施压行动，战区部队闻令而动，听令即打。 全天候、多方向进逼围岛，全面检验了联合作战体系支撑下的夺取制权、精确打击和立体风控能力。战区部队全时待战，随时能战，坚决粉碎任何形式的台独分裂和外来干涉图谋，敢于斗争，敢于胜利。
So the first thing to understand is this all stems from China's insistence that the West stay out of what is essentially a domestic dispute in their eyes. China and Taiwan have been in a long, decades-long dispute after the ousted government during the revolution ran off to the island and took it over. And their plan was to regroup and then go back to retake the mainland. But it became apparent that that plan wasn't tenable, so they instead just kept the island and developed it into what it is today. But the mainland government never recognized the annexation of the island and the demands that the Taiwanese government acknowledge, the mainland demands that the Taiwanese government acknowledge that they lost the war and that they're all part of one China, and China demands everyone stay out of their internal dispute. But the West doesn't want to do this because Taiwan is essentially another relic from the Cold War era of trying to halt Soviet influence. The ousted government was backed by the U.S., while the Mao government was backed by the Soviets. And similar to what's going on in Cuba, old habits die hard. So the U.S. has taken its stance regarding the island, and no matter if it's beneficial or harmful, the status quo stands. Now, here's how harmful this could become. Ask yourself whether or not it matters to you, sitting where you are right now, if Taiwan is its own independent country or if it's part of China. Now, remember Hong Kong. Hong Kong was once under British rule, and now it's under China. And how much has that changed your life? Has it changed at all? I suppose Great Britain could have said, no, there's no way we're giving Hong Kong back. It's all about democracy and freedom, and we're keeping it, and we're willing to fight for it. But they didn't, and what's happened? Do you notice anything different? No, you probably don't. Most people have no idea what happened with Hong Kong and don't care. So we have to ask ourselves the same question regarding Taiwan. Why would we fight for them rather than just allow them to peacefully unify the same way Hong Kong did? Here's Texas Rep. Michael McCall being asked this very question on Meet the Press.
Make the basic case for why Americans not only should care about what happens in Taiwan, but should be willing to spill American blood and treasure to defend Taiwan.
Nobody wants that. I think the deterrence is key here. We traveled to Japan, South Korea. We are in Guam. We're meeting with our allies, our partners here, if you will. They don't have a NATO in the Pacific, but they do have partners. We want to make sure that they are ready and supportive of the United States and Taiwan. The case for Taiwan, that's a very good question. About 50% of international trade goes through the international straits, but I think more importantly, Chuck, is that the TSMC manufactures 90% of the advanced global supply of advanced semiconductor chips. If China invades and either owns or breaks this, we're in a world of hurt, globally.
Congressman, it almost sounds like the case that would be made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of why America was spending so much money and military resources in the Middle East. Oil was so important for the economy. Is this sort of the 21st century version of that?
I personally, I think it's about democracy and freedom.
Okay. All right. So it's about semiconductors. Well, then why don't we just make our own? And so what if we relied on China for them? We rely on them for nearly everything as it is. Now, I'm not advocating for that. I do think we need to be self-sufficient, but nearly everything in our lives is made in China. So what's it to us if one more thing is made in China? And if it's really about democracy and independence, then why didn't we fight for Hong Kong rather than allow Britain to peacefully give them up? Now, here's Lindsey Graham saying he's willing to send U.S. troops to fight for Taiwan.
Strategic ambiguity is not working. China, after Afghanistan, believes that the store is open, that you can go in and take whatever you want on Biden's watch. So the question for the Congress, should we have a defense agreement with the island of Taiwan? We don't. Should we have one? But yes, I'd be very much open to using U.S. forces to defend Taiwan because it's in our national security interest to do so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you may hate China and think they're an enemy. I personally don't see them as an enemy, but as an economic competitor whom we need to work smarter and harder against. But even if you do view them as an enemy, is it really worth sending our sons and daughters over to fight them? The models show a slim to none chance that the U.S. would win in a war with China in their neck of the woods. If, and it's a big if, we did win, we'd be stuck having to defend Taiwan indefinitely. And you could bet China would regroup and try again. It would be never-ending war with countless Americans sent to die, and for what? Semiconductors? And by the way, it wouldn't just be our troops sent off to die. With China rising as the new economic world power, once they gain a full grip, you can bet they'd give us a dose of our own medicine by heavily sanctioning us. The U.S. could quickly look like Iran or Venezuela if Saudi Arabia switches sides, which it looks like they might be doing, and the rest of the world probably wouldn't come to our rescue. They'd likely say, you know what, it's about time you get what you give. This is an incredibly dangerous path to go down and one that cannot be understated. All right, guys, we are experiencing out of control inflation, and though the Fed keeps raising rates, it doesn't seem to be working, which means something else could be going on, like a lot of countries dumping the dollar, dumping it back onto our shores. Maybe that's why we're experiencing a bunch of inflation. You know, maybe the world is saying we're done with the dollar. Well, long-term bonds have diminished in value. Banks are going under. Depositors are holding their breath. Investors are bailing on bank stocks. Diversification has never been more important. The recent surge in gold prices is directly tied to the extreme market volatility right now. And this is why gold has historically been a great hedge against the stock market and against inflation. So now would be a great time to diversify into gold with Birch Gold Group. Birch Gold makes it easy to convert an IRA or 401k into an IRA in precious metals. Here's what you need to do. Visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit on gold, and they're going to help you convert your existing IRA or 401k that's tied to that volatile market out there into an IRA in precious metals that's gold and silver, and it's all tax sheltered. So visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit on gold today. Well, China recently brokered a historic peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Why this is significant is because these two countries have been in a Cold War of sorts since the fall of the Shah in 1979. Saudi Arabia, as well as the United States, was worried that the Iranian Revolution would spread and that the same sentiment that caused the people in Iran to overthrow the Shah would do the same thing in Saudi Arabia against the monarchy. Now, this would obviously threaten the monarchy's power, but also the United States' deal with the Saudi family to buy and sell oil in dollars, what we call the petrodollar. So if new leadership came to power in the Arabian Peninsula, then the petrodollar deal could be over. And of course, the United States didn't want that. So we've seen over the past several decades a concerted effort by the U.S. government to protect the Saudi family and the dollar being tied to oil. Saudi Arabia and Iran haven't been in any direct conflicts, but they've remained in a Cold War, with each side battling the other in proxy conflicts throughout the Middle East and Africa. And each country has been backing these different opposing sides in various levels of conflicts in places like Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. And the Iranians' objective has been, no doubt, to diminish Western influence and meddling in the Middle East. And the groups that they've backed have had the same exact objective. Now, Saudi Arabia has been tied to the U.S. for security and working at the behest of the West to do things to continue destabilizing the region, like exporting their radical Islamic sect called Wahhabism, which has been the root belief of major terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And it's actually a made-up brand of Islam that was created when the Saudi family figured out that they could use religion to gain control over people. And it's worked very well, but it's also run way amok. It's just run out of control, and it's caused, obviously, some very serious terrorism issues throughout the Middle East and now into Africa and even into parts of Asia, as we've seen ISIS spread. But the new government in Saudi Arabia, run primarily by the young crown prince, is fed up with the old antics and is looking to modernize Saudi Arabia and knows that a stable Middle East is the key to the region's rise. Enter China. Now, the Chinese have economic motivations for stability in the Middle East, and now the various governments throughout that region see that it's better in the 21st century to be doing business with each other rather than suck up resources on war. Wish our U.S. government would figure that out as well. The effects from the peace agreement brokered by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia are quickly coming to fruition. Now, Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in Yemen have sat down together this past Sunday to discuss a permanent ceasefire. Saudi officials traveled to Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, to sit down with the Houthi officials, which they're now officially recognizing, the Houthis, and are discussing how to end the conflict with them entirely with the Houthis in power. So this is massive. They're going to recognize them as a government, do a peace agreement, and the Houthis will be in charge of at least a large part of Yemen, if not the entire nation, soon enough. Now, the war in Yemen started when, after the Arab Spring in 2011, it destabilized the country. And then in 2014, Houthi rebels, who are not friendly to the U.S., took control over the northern parts of the country, which triggered a civil war. And Saudi Arabia, backed with U.S. weapons, mounted a war against the Houthis, which were backed by Iran. And for the past 8 years, we've seen one of the worst humanitarian crises unfold. Children are starving, hundreds of thousands have been killed. But now that war might be ending. Iran and Saudi Arabia are at peace, and thus the many proxy wars they've been engaged in their 45-year-long Cold War could be coming to an end as well, thus showcasing the power of the peace agreement brokered by China. With us now to discuss is Syrian-British independent journalist Richard Medhurst. He's lived in Syria, Pakistan, Switzerland, and Austria, and covers the region extensively in his reporting. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Kim. It's a pleasure.
So what is the significance of this deal that happened last month, the Chinese brokered peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran? From your perspective, what is the big significance of this deal?
I mean, it's absolutely huge. You know, I said at the time that the fact that Chinese are the ones who brokered it is almost, just as significant as the deal itself. I think for the Chinese to have been the peacemakers here, it's so good for their image on the international stage. And it really kind of takes the wind out of the United States sails, because I think the United States has been trying to foster that image for a couple of decades, Bill Clinton and so on. Of course, George Bush kind of took a different route with that, and every president since. But it really made the U.S. look bad, and I don't think the Chinese did it just to make the United States look bad or anyone else look bad. But it was, I think they genuinely just wanted to see these two sides, hash things out and put an end to a lot of the misunderstandings and conflicts that have been taking place in the Middle East. And that's not to say that, either side necessarily caused them so all this suffering on purpose or something like that. But the significance of that is very big. And you have to remember that the Chinese are also leading the way, not just with peace negotiations, but with the Belt and Road Initiative. So they're really offering their model to the world, and they're saying, this is how we like to do things. If you want to join us, everybody's welcome, including the U.S., including the West. You're all welcome to join our Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road, because it's not only, it doesn't belong to China, and China is not leading it. It's really a multipolar world, and I think they're laying the groundwork for that. And this peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran is really an iteration of that, and they're showing themselves on the international stage as really competent actors. So I think that is one significant thing. And then of course, having the subsequent Yemeni Saudi talks is also very, very important, because there's so much suffering that's happened in Yemen. Poorest country in the world, the worst humanitarian crisis. I've done some exclusive reporting on this with a Yemeni economist. He, Oxford graduate, World Bank. He knows the ropes, and we used, we really just showed with the in the best case how Saudi Arabia was really destroying Yemen through this oil blockade. And one of the things that they're talking about now as a condition of this agreement with Yemen and Saudi Arabia, which I'm sure we'll get to in a second, is the reopening of the Hodeidah port. So that's very big.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Chinese have a very different strategy of bringing peace to the Middle East, which is business, versus the U.S. using bombs. The U.S. has been trying to stop Iran from spreading throughout the Middle East. The revolution that happened in 1979, trying to halt that from spreading throughout the Middle East. And now this is going to really harm the narrative, I think. And I think it's going to blow minds, honestly, here in the United States, when the narrative has been this entire time that Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism, that they've been exporting their terrorism all throughout the Middle East, backing these various groups. And we've been partnered with Saudi Arabia with an oil deal, oil for, selling the entire oil market being done in dollars in exchange for security for the state of Saudi Arabia, because of course they were worried that the Iran revolution, that revolution would spread and there would be maybe an overthrow of the Saudi family. But what's interesting is when if this deal, this Chinese brokered peace deal, actually starts to create, instead of spreading terrorism across the Middle East, it would spread peace across the Middle East, and you'd see more of these proxy wars ending, like Yemen and Syria and Iraq. If they go through the line and actually start ending these proxy wars, and these terrorist groups, these Iranian-backed rebel groups, end up becoming business partners with Saudi Arabia, minds are going to be blown in the United States.
Yeah.
Because the idea is you can't do business with these people. I mean, when you're labeling them a terrorist, what are you saying? You're saying we can't do business with them. They're dangerous. We have to eradicate them. So what is going to be I think the geopolitical impact for the United States when this deal ends up proving to be the thing that ends up bringing peace to most of the Middle East? I don't know if it'll work for Israel and Palestine, but for the rest of the Middle East, what do you think that's going to mean for the United States?
Joe Biden, I think, first of all, one of his campaign promises was ending this war in Yemen, and it's kind of funny because most of the people in his administration helped start it under Obama. And as you said, they've been partnered with Saudi Arabia. This is, a security agreement that's gone on for like 70 years now. And
Yeah.
The thing is, the Saudis are looking at the situation. They're looking at the Ukraine war. They're looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, and they see where things are going, and they want to be a part of this multipolar world. They don't want to be left out, because when you see it in business terms, as you just brought up, I mean, everybody is jumping on board the new Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Ukraine war has sort of created a framework where we are going to end up with a multipolar world, and Saudi Arabia doesn't want to be left out of that. In addition to that, from the United States, they've complained multiple times to Saudis that they're not getting enough support from the United States for this war. So they're really kind of, I mean, the Saudis are cutting their losses at this point, because they want more intelligence and logistical support, but it's not coming. And on the battlefield, I think the Houthis have proven themselves to be very, very competent, and especially when they struck Aramco, the oil refinery during, I think, their Formula One races or something. That was so embarrassing, utterly embarrassing. And on top of that, they struck the UAE. So you have all this technology, and that's been transferred from Iran to Yemen, proving itself on the battlefield and changing the landscape. And so, from a business point of view, from a geopolitical point of view, and from a military point of view, the Saudis really don't have any choice here but to cut their losses. And if that means, I'm not saying tomorrow morning the petrodollar is going to end or something, but if that means distancing themselves from Israel and the United States, then maybe that's where that's where things will go. But we'll see.
Yeah, and I wonder how much China pressured them to start the peace talks with Yemen, because as we know, China only has one foreign military base outside of China, and that's in Djibouti, which is right across the way from Yemen. There's a little strait that goes from the Gulf of Aden into the Red Sea, and that is where China's positioned. So it seems that they wouldn't want conflict in Yemen that could potentially cause an issue for ships for that Belt and Road Initiative to be going through into the Red Sea. They want to make sure they have access to that. So I wonder if, and that's that's the one spot that China seems to care about. If they're putting a military base there, you got to wonder what is so important about that one.
Cares about that spot.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Everybody's got
it's
a
their big
base in
shipping lane.
Djibouti.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I wonder how much they've pressured Saudi Arabia and said, look, you want to get in on this Belt and Road Initiative. You want to be a part of the new rising world power, which will be China, and the money and the petro yuan that they're probably, they're saying, look, you want our currency to be the currency
real.
to back to replace the petrodollar. So I'm wondering how much of that has to do with it.
I don't think too much, because like I said, the Saudis are they don't feel that the United States backs them enough to keep this war going. And they're not really winning on the battlefield either. So it's
Right.
They're really cutting their losses at this point and just saying, okay, that's enough.
Do you think Yemen, so right now Yemen is now split between the Houthis and the international backed government that is controlling the southern part of Yemen. Do you think it's going to become one government? Or do you think, I'm curious where this potential peace agreement goes for Yemen?
Well, basically, I mean, I think it's around 80% of Yemenis who live under the Houthi-controlled area. So, I mean,
Right.
most Yemenis live under the Houthi government and are okay with that government. And even though, as you said, the Saudi-backed one is the one that's internationally recognized.
Right.
What happened
For
is
now.
the Saudis went to them. Yeah, for now, exactly. They went to them and basically, they broke the news that we're negotiating with Sana'a, which is the Houthi capital, and Yemen's capital, and this relationship of us, supporting you in your plush hotels, it's going to end very soon. And the Houthis have been very clear that they want an unconditional withdrawal of Saudi forces and other foreign elements or foreign troops. They want reparations and rebuilding of the country. That's it's been completely devastated. The Hodeidah port, which as I mentioned is really it's not only the closest to most of Yemen's population, it's really the lifeline of Yemen's economy. And so as I showed in my reporting, all these vessels that were bound for Yemen, they would go, they would get their certification from the United Nations in Djibouti, incidentally, and then, despite having clearance, the Saudi or Saudi coalition would block these ships from going to Hodeidah and kind of just, take them aside, and just hold them for months, for even over a year, and the demurrage costs just mount and mount and mount, and so by the time this fuel even gets to the pump, and it's gone through, as I mentioned, this holding process, it's had to reroute to Aden, which is to the south, and then go through all these checkpoints that are controlled by Al Qaeda and people demanding, basically highway robbery, like literally highway robbery. By the time it reaches the pump in at the gas station, people are paying 50% or more for stuff that for completely unnecessary costs, and it's not just about filling up your gas tank. Hospitals, people's homes, everything depends on having fuel, and so all the costs just rise and rise and rise. And having this port now finally open is going to change everything. And it's at least part of that equation. I think also it's important to note that it's not just about having Hodeidah open. The wages, you have people who work in the civil service or basically public servants who've had their wages withheld for months, by the government in Aden. And they even moved the central bank to Aden and refused to pay people their wages. So finally having those wages released is a big part of it. And these are, very clear demands from the Houthi side. And last thing I'd add is a prisoner swap as well. That's also on the
Oh,
table.
right. Yeah, I saw that they were doing a prisoner swap of 13 Yemenis for one Saudi was one of the prisoner swaps
Something
that they
like
just
that. That's the
recently did. But I
ratio. Yeah.
think, yeah, but there may be more. So what's really interesting also I'm curious to get your perspective on, but obviously Iran wants nothing to do with the United States, wants the United States influence out of the Middle East. The Houthis as well absolutely do not want U.S. influence in the Middle East, believes that rightfully that the United States is a destabilizing force in the Middle East, continuing to meddle and wreak havoc and cause instability and wars. And obviously Assad in Syria would want nothing to do with the United States. So you've got all of these, really have been backed more by Iran, more on the Iran side of the Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran. None of them want the U.S. involved in the Middle East at all. And it looks like that side is winning all throughout the Middle East, that they're not backing down, they're not going away, they're not being overthrown. So, and now we're seeing the deals being made. So what do you think this means for U.S. influence in the Middle East?
Well, when we say they want nothing to do with the United States, I don't think it's entirely true. I think they just don't want anything to do with the current U.S. foreign policy. I don't think they inherently have anything against the U.S. or the U.K. for that matter. I really think people from Iran or Syria or the United States, they're all the same. Everybody's the same. They get along fine. It's just some people in certain U.S. administrations and British administrations, have really caused havoc, and as you mentioned, been destabilizing forces. We shouldn't forget.
Well,
also
when
the
was the
United
last?
States
What was the last U.S. government to have a friendly relationship with Iran? I mean, I don't know if it matters who switches out in the Oval Office.
well,
I
during
can't
the
think of the
Shah,
last. Okay, yeah, right. That was the last time. So in the
he's
70s,
very
but since
friendly, extremely friendly.
sure,
Yeah,
well, yeah, because the Shah was a U.S. backed person that was installed in Iran.
right.
But since then, I mean, I don't know if the U.S. has had any friendly relationships with anybody in Iran or Yemen or Syria, no matter the administration, left or right.
Well, if you go online and you look up a young Bashar al-Assad, you can see him, with Prince Charles and with Tony Blair, and Nancy Pelosi went to visit him in Damascus, and they were trying to woo him over to their side. And once that didn't work, then it was like, okay, well, you have to go, and because he took office after his father died, right? So it's very funny
Right.
actually seeing these pictures. They were so friendly to him, even the Queen received him at Buckingham Palace. So, they're friendly to you, but if you don't give in, it's kind of like the mob. You're a
Right.
loose end, and you're gonna have to go.
Right.
So I think it's interesting though, as you mentioned, that these governments, they've lasted throughout a persistent U.S. campaign to get rid of them, and I think it's not just funny, but it's a lesson to the world that diplomacy works, and it's
Yeah.
really good to mend ties and fix things that way. And I mean, the thing with Saudi Arabia and Syria is that it wasn't only Saudi Arabia that was backing various groups in there. It was like pretty much everybody who, they had their own horse they were betting on, and it is and was very wild in Syria. But definitely the Chinese broker deal of having Iran and Saudi Arabia come together. I mean, you saw instantly it mended ties with Yemen, hopefully, and with Syria. So this rapprochement is very, very important,
Yeah.
and yeah, it shows that even despite the U.S. influence through Saudi Arabia, you can still get around that by, I guess, incentivizing alternative options, as you mentioned, having maybe a petro yuan or something like that. I don't know if it's necessarily that factor or only that factor which convinced the Saudis. I think it's multiple things at once, but diplomacy works and it can be a very effective tool. And at the end of the day, what's going to happen is whether Western countries like it or not, they're going to have to sit down and work things out with Bashar al-Assad, with the Houthis, and with Iran. I mean, they're not going anywhere. And,
That's what it looks
it
like.
just shows you that, yeah, it just shows you that if the people in those countries don't want the leaders, they'll get rid of them one way or
Right.
another. I mean, no one could withstand this amount of pressure and not have their people's support. So I think it shows you, both of those things. It's important to remember that if your people don't want you, they'll get rid of you with or without U.S. support. And the fact that these that the revolution in Iran is continuing, and Bashar al-Assad is still in Syria, and the
Yeah.
Houthis are still in power, it shows they have popular support,
Right.
whether we like to say that in the West or not.
Yeah, that's true. Richard, thank you so much for joining the show. Where can people find your
Thank
work?
you. On youtube.com/Richard Medhurst. They can follow me on Twitter or go to richardmedhurst.com.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Kim.
A recent Daily Caller investigation shed more light on the cozy ties between big tech and the intelligence community. Daily Caller scoured through LinkedIn to see how many former FBI, DOJ, DHS, and CIA employees were hired by big tech social media companies like Google, Facebook, and Twitter. And the number they uncovered so far is 248 people between the years of 2018 and 2022. And the jobs these former agents took at social media companies have titles such as embedded security manager, senior director, security specialist, director of corporate security and risk, and director of corporate resilience, whatever that means. Here to discuss is whistleblower Steve Friend, former FBI and author of True Blue, My Journey from Beat Cop to Suspended FBI Whistleblower. Steve is actually quoted in the Daily Caller investigation as saying, "There has been an enormous spike in big tech hiring of former FBI employees beginning in 2018. I think it is important because it was around this time we saw a lot of the censorship of conservative accounts." Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Kim.
So let's talk about this censorship of these conservative accounts. We're seeing this influx of these police type people, FBI, CIA, DOJ, going into social media. Those jobs, those titles, are those the censorship titles that we're seeing now now we're seeing that big tech has been censoring quite a bit?
Well, certainly the job titles are not really very descriptive of anything particular that they would be doing. And it's not unusual for somebody to transition from government service to the private sector after having served a full career. But to me, and even doing my own independent research on this, was part of this piece that came through the Daily Caller, there was just this enormous spike. It seemed to be a few hirings here and there for the last years leading up to 2018. But in 2018, there was an enormous jump, and they were people that were high-ranking executives within the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security, who were 3-4 years from cashing in on a pretty lucrative pension. So in order to make that decision, to me, it meant that there was a significant financial incentive for them to do that, and that they might also be doing something that their subject matter of expertise, being in the executive role that they were in, it was going to bode well for both the government and for social media.
So these people they went to these big tech companies before they retired, not after. Why would they do that? Why would they go before retirement rather than after retirement? It seems like you'd wait, then collect your pension, your retirement, and then go work for big tech, especially if it's only a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not privy to their contracts for hiring, but it would have to be pretty high in order to forego the benefits of that. And then not just that, but the esteem of having retired a full term of service to your country and run that race all the way through was obviously something that I wasn't able to do. It's a tremendous honor to having on your wall that plaque that says that you were a retired special agent with the FBI. So for them to do that, I think that the financial reward had to be there. And I think there's also an aspect to it that allows both the government and the private sector big tech companies to play sort of this accountability hot potato. And because these folks were in high executive roles with the FBI or the Homeland or CIA, they had the institutional knowledge, they had the connections with people who they would come up through the ranks with, who were people who are going to still be there, not having moved on and gone off on their own. And so there was tremendous value to having them actually leave a few years before their predetermined retirement.
Okay, so two questions pop in my head when I hear this, because it is just so odd to leave your job a couple of years before retirement. You would get a pension, you would get the retirement, and then you would still collect the big tech money. So I don't understand this unless, one question, is it possible, and I don't know if this is, so maybe you could answer it, is it possible that they would work both jobs? Are they able to work on the public front, be like, yeah, I transitioned over to big tech, I'm with big tech, but secretly be still working for the government? Is that possible?
Not in any sort of official capacity, but I think that you can. It doesn't take a lot of conspiratorial minds to come up with an idea where somebody moves on to the private sector, but because they still have relationships with people back in their prior government post, they can sort of help them navigate around the hurdles that they might need to get through subpoena processes or search warrant processes. But as we came to find out, especially from Meta, there was an operation that the FBI was running called Operation Bronze Griffin, where confidential human sources were providing private information from the accounts back to the FBI without those subpoenas and search warrants that are supposed to be issued. And they were doing it sort of in this capacity as an informant. And that is that's a hack around due process.
But again, you could be an informant after you've retired. I mean, you're still going to have those relationships and those connections inside of the FBI or the DOJ or the CIA. So that doesn't, okay. So what about, is it possible that they, I'm just trying to figure out why they would do this right before they would retire. It just seems so odd. Is it, do they lose some kind of security clearance once they retire? Is there like, once you retire and you no longer get access to these files, that if you don't retire for whatever reason, you would still have access to them?
Well, when you leave the agency, it's need to know. So you don't need a security clearance. So they would actually be giving that up. I think, though, the timing of it to me indicates a lot more. 2018, 19, 20, there's 2 election cycles were in there. It was a very contentious election, midterm, and especially in 2020 presidential cycle. And from what we saw, and now in the time since then, there was a lot of censorship that went on social media. And I think, going back to what I said before, with the accountability, you generate a situation where the FBI says, look, we're not telling them how to run their show. It's a private sector. We're offering suggestions and guidelines. And then you go to the other side and they say, look, we're just following the guidelines that the government lays out before us. We're really not making these decisions. And that gives plausible deniability to both sides. And as we found out, censorship was rampant across all of big tech and social media.
So they must have just given them a lot of money and said, look, it's worth it for you to leave retirement. Yeah, you're going to give up your pension. You're going to give up all of this, but you're going to get so much more money that you're not going to even miss it. That must have been what they ultimately did. We, of course, can't see their salaries on LinkedIn. Would be nice if they had to disclose that. What do you think the motivation is then for these? I mean, besides money, what's the motivation for, well, it's money obviously on the person that's being recruited to social media, but what do you think the motivation is for social media to bring these people in to these particular jobs? Because really, it's not in the best interest of social media to censor users from a business perspective. They would want lots of different voices, lots of different people, and that brings more to the platform. That's good for business. We know that the censorship was not good for business. It was really at the pressure and the behest of the government. Do you think the government was pressuring these big tech companies to hire these employees? And maybe even the government handpicked some of the employees that would move from the from inside of these departments to social media companies?
Well, I think that the folks that were moving on from government service to the private sector, they were holding positions that was very apparent, the sort of connections that they had. And as you climb the rungs of power, certainly there's less and less rungs. It's a smaller and smaller circle. So it's just really the pool of people that you could pull from. They all sort of know each other. They know the inner workings. They have that Rolodex of contact information. I don't know if it would be any particular person who would have any sort of subject matter expertise, because at least in my experience, folks, as they ascend their ladders, they're further and further removed from the actual work that's being done on the ground, and they might not necessarily have it. Essentially, you're paying for their access. So then moving on, and then back to your original question about the benefit for these big tech and the social media companies. I think you have to look to something that Senator Feinstein was talking about when she sort of directed all these CEOs that they needed to take corrective action or the government would. So it might be actually in their best interests to hire on these people, help them tiptoe through the raindrops, if you will, and avoid scrutiny from the government and cooperate with the government. And that is going to allow the government to get the information that it wants, to get the outcomes that it might prefer from elections, and maybe pull the heat back away from these social media companies. No more of the Section 230 pressure all of a sudden that we were hearing so much about before the last presidential cycle. That's kind of fallen by the wayside now that you have a Democrat president.
Yeah, would hate to have something happen to your nice little business, is what the government basically said to these social media companies. So they went and hired a bunch of government people. What else would, if you weren't going to go into social media as one of these security type jobs that they've hired former FBI and CIA, what other jobs do people typically transition out of these departments into prior to this?
Just having a law enforcement background, it bodes really well. A lot of people enter into sort of private investigations. They can do threat assessments. That's something that I looked into even when I left from the FBI. You know, my background, I had information for school security. As we saw in Nashville, that's something that's going to be on the front of everybody's mind now. And that's where people who have tactical experience and law enforcement experience, they can come to the fold. They can identify the problems and really make suggestions to how to beef up security. So that's something, and I think people just always fall back on their skill set. So a lot of lawyers, there's a lot of accountants who are in the FBI. So those people can go back to the private sector, and there's nothing stopping them. At least from what we saw with Tim Tebow, I believe he went to work for KPMG. Or, I'm sorry, Steve D'Antuono. Steve D'Antuono, he went to work from KPMG as a partner.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. People should be able to use their skill set and use it in a capacity that makes sense. And if they're in the security world, then it makes sense for them to move to security. I think the big problem that we have, and I know you've called a lot of attention to this, is just that this has then turned into a different type of security, one that I don't think we really need, which is censoring Americans, right? We got to secure ourselves from the opinions of other Americans. Oh my gosh, because their opinions might sway you to, I don't know, think differently. What a crime. Right?
Yes. We've definitely expanded the definition of threat, and that's gone across the board. There's a lot of mission creep with national security now. As we saw recently with this revelation about the infiltration that's gone on with these Catholic parishes. There's threats around every corner from the FBI's perspective, but unfortunately, I think the threats are people who are maybe objecting to the way that the government's comporting itself, and not necessarily physical threats to people's safety.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I don't know if you know much about, I just saw the reports on this today about the Catholic infiltration, about what were they doing? They were putting FBI informants inside of what, church groups, Bible studies? What were they doing? And what were they looking for?
Well, the original whistleblower disclosure that Kyle Seraphin came out with was this intelligence report from the Richmond division that was about quote unquote radical traditional Catholics who might be prone to become radical extremists because they held these very problematic views about traditional marriage and pro-life and pro-border security. And the FBI said, look, it's a low-level employee, low-level analyst. This didn't meet our exacting standards. We've corrected the problem. Well, now it's come to find out that they lied about that, and they're willing to really go down to some pretty deep depths of deception. And they were actually tasking, there was an operation in place where they assigned an undercover agent to infiltrate these Catholic parishes to perform what is called a Type 5 assessment, which is them assessing whether or not anybody there could be recruited to be a paid or maybe a voluntary informant on the FBI's behalf to inform on any radicalization that might be going on. So essentially asking people to inform on their fellow parishioners because they might hold beliefs that the government deems to be problematic and radical, and those being pro-life, pro-marriage, pro-border security, which are legitimate beliefs that large swaths of the country holds. But now that the FBI is deeming these to be problematic, I think it spells some problems for a lot of people around the country.
Did they ever do this sort of infiltration or looking for informants when it came to child molestation accusations inside of the Catholic Church, or did that just get, oh yeah, no, we'll just we'll investigate those as people come forward saying that they've been molested? I mean, it's like, where are the priorities with this?
Well, certainly they're now focused a lot of resources on domestic terrorism, as they call it. And if you look at the top 4 priorities that the National Security Branch listed, 2 of them are radical anti-government extremism and radical ethnic extremism, specifically white supremacy. Well, the President of the United States called anybody who voted Republican a white supremacist and a anti-government extremist.
Right.
So now the guns have been turned around on about half the country who decided to pull the lever for a GOP nominee for office. And it's just a further indication that the FBI has become this political weaponized arm of the administration now, and is no longer doing the work of all the American people. It's just doing the call from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah, this new revelation that they were spying on Catholics inside the Catholic Church is actually, I mean, freedom of religion is under attack in this country at this point. I'm not a religious person anymore, but I appreciate the ability for people to practice their religion as they choose, and they shouldn't be called terrorists because they hold a belief that might be very conservative to some. And that is really an enormous attack, and that should make everybody in every religion worry that they're being spied on now by the U.S. government. This should be not just Catholics, but if you are any religion at all, if you are Mormon, if you are Protestant, whatever you might be, if you're a Scientologist, a Jehovah's Witness, you know that they're spying on you, that they're looking at you, wondering, what is it you're up to? What kind of belief do you have that is counter to whatever it is that they think you should be thinking or believing? I mean, that is really, truly outrageous that they're spying on Catholics inside of the Catholic Church. That's what they did to Muslims. They would say, oh, we've got to spy on the Muslims in the mosques because there might be a terrorist in there.
Exactly.
And now they've taken that exact operation and moved it to other churches. And that's the way it works. If they're going to do it to one, they're going to do it to you. You just wait.
Yes, I'm glad you pointed that out about the Muslim Americans. That's something that folks on the left have been reporting about for decades, really since 9/11. Trevor Aaronson's done some pretty heavy lifting on that. He wrote about Terror Factory, where the FBI was essentially creating cases and entrapping Muslim Americans who were not predisposed to commit any sort of terrorist act. And we all kind of just shrugged our shoulders at the time, much to our own shame in that. But now it's a reminder that the Nehemiah poem about first they came for the trade unionists and I said nothing. Well, now they're coming for the largest sect of Christianity in this country. And if nobody steps up at this point, who knows who's next?
Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find your book?
Right now it's on pre-sale. It'll be coming out in June. It's on Amazon. True Blue, My Journey from Beat Cop to Suspended FBI Whistleblower. You can also look for it at Barnes & Noble. I believe Target has it. But obviously Amazon is the big 600-pound gorilla in the room. So it's easily accessible there.
Right. All right, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kim.
Well, I don't know how these guys have been doing it, but the pranksters Vovin and Lexus once again posed as Zelensky, and they held a phone call with Europe's central bank president, Christine Lagarde. And she says some really shocking things about the digital euro, that they're going to be rolling out in October and controlling how people spend their money and overseeing it. And they're going to be able to really track. And also she talks about criminal penalties that are put on people who use cash over a certain amount. Let's watch.
I have a question about, I'm also a good user of electronic money. So my question, you're introducing the electronic euro, as I know.
Yeah.
So how can switching to an electronic currency help?
Well, two things. Number one, it will be decided in October. So we are preparing the ground. We want to be ready. we want to be trained, but it will not be decided until October 23. The reason I'm personally convinced that we have to move ahead is a situation like the one we are in now. We are dependent on the supply of gas by a very unfriendly country. I don't want Europe to be dependent on an unfriendly country's currency. For instance, I don't know, the Chinese currency, the Russian currency, the whatever, or dependent on a friendly currency, but which is activated by a private corporate entity like Facebook or like Google or anybody like that.
I'm user of Bitcoin too, so I had bought it when it started, and I hope that it also will work through the special system. And I know there are many protests in Europe against the electronic euro. What is the reason?
It's the beauty of Europe. It has different positions. If you ask in Northern Europe, for instance, in the Netherlands, they're quite happy to see the e-euro coming. If you ask a young German man, he'll say, yeah, fine. As I said, I don't want Meta, Google, or Amazon to suddenly come up with a currency that will take over the sovereignty of Europe. I don't want a foreign currency to become the currency of trading within Europe. So we have to be ready.
No, the problem is they don't want to be controlled. They don't want to.
Yeah, but you know what? Now we have in Europe this threshold above 1,000 euros, you cannot pay cash. If you do, you are on the gray market. So you take your risk. You get caught, you are fined, or you go in jail. But the digital euro is going to have a limited amount of control. There will be control. You're right. You're completely right. We are considering whether for very small amounts, anything that is around 300, 400 euros, we could have a mechanism where there is zero control. But that could be dangerous. The terrorist attacks on France back 10 years ago were entirely financed by those very small anonymous credit cards that you can recharge in total anonymity.
I mean, really, just unbelievable, unbelievable. Admitting that this is going to be a mechanism for control, admitting that, oh, we've got to stop terrorists. And this is always the excuse that they use. It's for safety and security, safety and security. That is why we need to control you and we need to know everything that you're doing. I do think she misspoke about the $1,000. I believe it is $10,000 you're not allowed to spend in Europe, but it is actually set. I think that's the actual European Union limit is 10,000. If you spend anything more than that, it is illegal to do it in cash. However, they've allowed each individual country to then set their own limits, and some of them are very low. So, for example, in Greece or in France, it is under that, I think even $2,000, it's under that. You're not allowed to spend that in cash. That means they want to track your spending. They're worried if you use large amounts of cash that you're up to no good. You're up to something nefarious, and they want to know what you're spending your money on. That is why they want to track it. That is why they want to move to a central bank digital currency. And what we see in Europe is just a precursor for what they're trying to do here, which is the exact same thing. And here's an example of the grooming towards CBDCs that the Fed is doing. Take a look at this tweet thread that they put out a few days ago. Here they say, is Fed now replacing cash? It is a central bank digital currency. FedNow is not related to a digital currency. FedNow is a payment service the Federal Reserve is making available for banks and credit unions to transfer funds. They're asking this, they're answering this question on their Twitter account a few days ago because they've said they're rolling out this FedNow program, this payment program called FedNow. They're rolling it out in July. So people are asking these questions and they're answering them in this tweet thread, starting off with, is this replacing cash? Is this central bank digital currency? And they say, no, it's not a digital currency. It's a payment service. They go on to say, FedNow service is neither a form of currency nor a step toward eliminating any form of payment, including cash. The FedNow service is an instant payment service provided by the Federal Reserve, launching in July 2023. FedNow will be available to depository institutions such as banks and credit unions in the United States and will enable individuals and businesses to send instant payments through the depository institution accounts. Instant payments allow individuals and businesses to send and receive payments within seconds at any time of the day, on any day of the year, so that the receiver of the payment can use the funds almost instantly. Sounds nice, right? And I'll get into why this is important, why this connects to CBDCs or how it does. The Federal Reserve has made no decision on issuing a central bank digital currency, a CBDC, and would not do so without clear support from Congress and the executive branch, ideally in the form of a specific authorizing law. A CBDC would not replace cash or other payment options. Learn more about the FedNow and the Fed's work, right? Okay, so they go on about this. But here's the thing. Even though FedNow is not a CBDC, that's true. What it is a highly centralized system that gives the Fed direct access to your bank account. Every payment made through FedNow must comply with applicable controls and goes through a Fed-controlled server. The system wouldn't be only used for peer-to-peer payments, but also for consumer-to-government and government-to-consumer payments, which means automatic debiting from your account and automatic stimulus, giving the government even more direct control over your bank account. So while FedNow is not technically a central bank digital currency and does not have a blockchain or equivalent on-chain flow, it is what people fear when they talk about CBDC, central bank digital control. That is what they're worried about, central bank digital control over the money. The fundamental question is whether or not FedNow increases the Fed's control over the lives of individuals, and the answer is yes, it does. It's the step they're making because so much negative attention has been placed on CBDCs, with politicians like Ron DeSantis saying he's looking to ban it. So the Fed is now looking for a workaround, and FedNow looks to be just that. All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for watching. Appreciate you being here. We will have another great show for you tomorrow night. Same time, same place. We are here every night, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Central, Monday through Friday. Be sure to follow the show or subscribe to the show so that you get the notifications when we're on the air. But don't miss it. And also, you could join my locals community. That button is down below. That is how you can support this individual, independent journalism venture that we've got going on here. And really appreciate your support. You get behind the scenes stuff. I post random videos, do some live streams. There's a lot of interaction on the locals community, a lot of really great information that people post. So join there. It's a great way to support the show if you're looking for a way to do that. I do get emails from people asking, Kim, how can I support your independent journalism? Locals is a great place and a great way for you guys to do that. So that button is down below. Thank you so much for watching. That is it. We will be back tomorrow night, same time, same place. Until then, good night.